Started in just a minute, but as folks are joining, we encourage you to say hello in the chat. Although this is a webinar, it is going to be an interactive session, so we want you to start warming up now. If you can head over, make sure you open up the chat and turn it to say to panelists and attendees. Oops, and say hello. Welcome. Hello, hello. This is great. Good morning, everyone. I'd love to hear too if this is the first event that you're joining from Austin Design Week, or if you've been to other events this week and where you're joining from. Oh, we have folks from London and Boston and Colorado. This is awesome. This is one of the magical things about ADW being mostly virtual this year. Lots of folks from Austin, of course, Mexico City and Houston. Oh, this is fantastic. 4th Austin Design Week. I love hearing that. 4 out of the 5 years you've been with us. You've been to the sustainability workshop. Great second event for you. Been here all week. I love it. Barcelona, welcome. Great. I love this. Keep it going in the chat. If you're just joining us, we're just saying hello. If you want to let us know where you're joining from, if you've been to Austin Design Week before, and if you've been to other events this week, we'd love to hear from you. It's going to be interactive today, so get that chat going and make sure to update so that it says panelists and attendees. Otherwise, you're just sending Giannis and I things, and we want to talk to everyone in the chat. So welcome, we'll get started. My name is Danielle Barnes. My pronouns are she, her, and I'm one of the co-founders and organizers of Austin Design Week. And I'm so excited to welcome you to the 3rd day of our 5th annual Austin Design Week. So thank you all who have been joining us throughout the week, who've been joining us in years past, and welcome to those of you who this is your first event. You'll see here on our slide, we have ways to engage with us on social media. So we encourage you to take screenshots or pictures, tag us, make sure that you share some of your favorite quotes or learnings. We want to hear from you. I'm going to go to the next slide. And as I mentioned, there's a ton happening all week. We are mostly virtual this year. We have a couple of in-person distance ways that you can engage, but most of them are online. And so we encourage you to head to that link right there that you'll see, the bit.ly/ADW20, and you can check out all the events that are happening this year, all free to attend. Also, if you haven't already, I encourage you to join our Slack channel. I can send a link to that in the chat to make sure that everyone has it, but that's going to be a really great way to engage throughout the week. So we send announcements there. You can introduce yourself, meet other people from the community, and it's also where we keep the conversation going. So folks share learnings, continue chatting after this, so we encourage you to check that out. And you'll also see our awesome volunteers are sending some information. So be sure to check out the chat and everything that they're sharing there. Next slide. And then finally, I want to say thank you to our partners. Austin Design Week, I'll say it again, completely free event, all volunteer run. So in addition to really just giving a huge thanks to our volunteers who help out year round, the week of, to our hosts and our community partners, I also want to give a shout out to our sponsors who make sure that we can make this happen, keep it free, have a website and great design. So a big thanks to all of them. And without further ado, I'm going to hand it over to your host for today, Giannis, who I think has been involved in most, if not all, Austin Design Weeks. So you're truly in for a treat. Welcome, Giannis.
Thanks, Danielle. Yeah, I think I've been with Austin Design Week since 2016, I believe. I don't know if that's the first year, but hi everyone. My name is Giannis Hegenwald. I'm a designer at Trello at Atlassian. I'm based in Austin. My pronouns are he, him. I'm so excited to be here. Thanks to you for being here today. Thank you to Austin Design Week and all the organizers and volunteers for making this happen during this really intense time for everyone. Huge kudos to all of you. Like I said, I'm a designer at Atlassian Trello. If you haven't heard of Atlassian, we basically make software for teams. We've got products like Trello and Jira, and I recommend you check them out if you're looking for collaboration tools. Before we dive in, I want to give a quick shout out. We are hiring at Trello and Atlassian. We've got a ton of positions that are opening up. So if you're looking right now, whether you're a designer or a product manager or an engineer or a marketer or something else, check out our website and feel free to reach out to me or other fellow Atlassians on LinkedIn and ask us about these positions. I'd love to help you figure out if Atlassian is a good place for you. So with that being said, let's get started. I said on my first slide that I'm based in Austin, but I'm actually born in Bremen, Germany. Grew up in a city in the north of Germany. This is what it looks like. It's a pretty old city. It's like literally thousands of years old, at a big river. And this here is the school I went to. This is actually the school. It's called Old High School, Altes Gymnasium. And when I was in middle school there, most of my teachers were in their 60s. They grew up during the Second World War or shortly after. And the reason I'm telling you this is because this is the place where I started learning about language. And there was one moment specifically in 7th grade German class that I remember very vividly. We were discussing the end of a book, and I said to the teacher that I said that I didn't feel like it was a good final solution to the plot of the book. My teacher got incredibly upset with me, like really, really upset. And it's intimidating when you have an old teacher in 7th grade. And this is the word I used, Endlösung. It's a German word. It's made up of two words, the word Ende, end, and the word Lösung, which is solution. And it literally translates into English to final solution. Now, what I didn't know when I used that word, and the reason my teacher got so upset, is that this is a word that we don't use anymore in Germany. And the reason for that is that it was a word that was used by the Nazis to describe and mask the genocide of Jewish people during the Holocaust. It's part of this phrase, Endlösung der Judenfrage, final solution to the Jewish question, which is a perfidious euphemism for the systematic murder of Jews. And what I learned on that day, basically, is that we in Germany have this area of language that we call Nazi-Sprech, or Nazi speak. And it's language that was used by the Nazis to manipulate people. It's language that we try to not use anymore in Germany. So this was the first moment, the first time that I realized that familiar words can be harmful regardless of intent. The words that seem harmless without context can be incredibly harmful once you know their context and impact. And that's kind of what I want to talk about today. How do we go about unlearning language and unlearning some of the harmful patterns that we've internalized and instead become active shapers of language? As designers, we're in a really great position for this. And today I want to take you on a bit of a journey of what I've learned so far and what I'm trying to unlearn and how I'm trying to do better at it. There are a lot of ways that language is beautiful and powerful and inspiring and so much more. And today we won't really focus on that too much, but rather we'll start with unlearning the bad patterns that come so natural to us, unfortunately. Fundamentally, what we'll talk about is that if we're not careful about our language, it can have all these effects. It can be disparaging, it can be discriminatory, it can be prejudice, and the list goes on and on. The reason that it's not moving is that Canva is playing some sort of joke on me, so there's no animation. But the list goes on and on. And today we want to take a first step to do less of that and become more inclusive and sensitive about our language. So for the session today, we'll have three parts. The first part is we'll talk a little bit about how does language impact our reality. Like generally, what does it do? Then we'll talk about some areas of language that we need to look out for and how we start to develop a bit of a spidey sense of, oh, this is possibly something that we need to be very deliberate and careful about. And the third part is how do we become agents for inclusive language? How do we make this and turn this into action? And because this is a virtual setting, unfortunately, we can't all be in a room right now, and I can't see your faces and we can't interact actively. We're going to break this out into sessions with Q&A in between. So I'll talk a little bit, and then we'll do a quick break, and we'll do a bit of Q&A. I'll talk, we'll do Q&A, and towards the end, we'll do some more Q&A and discussion. So I encourage you to use the chat actively. I see that some folks are already posting. I love it. Also, there's a Q&A function where you can post a question. And then I'll pick them up and we'll go through them one by one. So how does language impact our reality? There are a million ways to slice and dice this, but here's the mental model that works for me. When I think about the impact of language, I think about 4 levels. The first one is that language has the power to hurt people, because language can tap into cultural and historical and personal trauma. So this is really direct and really visceral, that is just hurtful. I'll give you an example of this. In software engineering, we have used in the past, and I hope we do less of this right now, we have used the terms master-slave to describe components of a system. And seeing these terms that have clear historic, cultural, and personal connotations used like carelessly in this environment can be extremely hurtful for people, even on a very personal level. The second level that I think about is that language has the power to exclude, because it can promote ethnic and racial invisibility. It can ignore the history and achievement of cultures. So this is a little abstract. So let me give you a very, very simple example of this, specifically for invisibility. We often in design use, and I hope we do less of that, use the term skin color. And usually what we're trying to do is actually describe the color beige or cream. And so when we're norming skin color to white or beige, we're contributing to the invisibility of other races and to the systemic racism that is in our language. So it's a good example of something that promotes racial invisibility, although the intent is not necessarily negative when people use this. The third level that I think about is that language has the power to reinforce inequity, prejudice, and discriminatory systems. An example of that are the terms whitelist and blacklist. If you're not familiar with these terms, a whitelist is traditionally used as a list of people or things that are considered acceptable and trustworthy. And a blacklist, on the other hand, is a list of people or things that are regarded as unacceptable or untrustworthy. And associating white and black with these general good and bad ideas really reinforces racist notions and contributes to systemic racism through our words. The last and fourth level that I think of, and this is the sneakiest one of all of them, is how language frames our reality through grammar, vocabulary, associations, and perceptions. And this is sneaky because it happens on the subconscious level. So I'll give you an example. In German, the word bridge is gendered female, while in Spanish, it's gendered male. And researchers have found that the gender of these words actually impacts how German and Spanish people think of bridges. And so German speakers, because bridge, die Brücke, is female, tend to associate what they consider female attributes, like beautiful and slender, with bridges, while Spanish speakers tend to associate what they consider male attributes, like big and sturdy, with bridges. Whether or not we agree with these female and male attributes is a different story, but these underlying grammatical structures actively affect how our associations and they frame our reality. So those are the four layers of general impact that I think of when we think of language, right? Language has the power to hurt people very directly. Language has the power to exclude people from society, from certain groups. Language has the power to reinforce good things, but more importantly for today, bad things like systemic discrimination. And language on a very fundamental level has the power to frame our reality through perceptions, associations, connotations. I'll stop here real quick to open it up for some questions. Does anybody have questions or comments? I see some folks are posting in the chat here already some really great contributions. So Erica just posted a question whether I was saying the word bridge. And yes, that's correct. This is the word bridge that in German is gendered female, die Brücke, and in Spanish is gendered male, el puente. And so through that gendering in our grammatical structures in those languages, we start to influence the connotations and the perceptions. I appreciate the comment, Jen. That's really kind. And yeah, I agree. I do believe that language and how we communicate is really important, especially in 2020. Oh, this is a perfect segue. What's the best way? Austin Design Week just asked, what's the best way to know if a word has this additional context we might not know about? So there is no bulletproof way to always check, and not everyone has the ability or the freedom to actually look this up. But I'll share a few resources in a minute and a few ways that we can start to A, develop the spidey sense for language, or also B, look up some things and learn more about the details and the history of language. There are a couple of questions in the Q&A section, so I'll repeat them in case you can't see them. I hope I pronounced this right. Sankalida is how I pronounce it. Asked, do you think that when we speak a language that is not our first one, we may actually miss out context, thus making it hurtful? I think that is likely to happen. I think that's happened to me a number of times. I'm not an English native speaker, and terms that in German seem to be acceptable are sometimes not acceptable in English and very hurtful and harmful in English. So I think if you're not a native speaker, you're probably more at risk because you're not as familiar with the connotations of and the cultural notions that surround language. Louis is asking if there are any recommendations for working with international teams. This is a tricky one. Kind of connected to the question before, I would recommend approaching international teams and teams that are not as familiar with your language with grace and some forgiveness, because most likely, or at least that's my personal approach, they're not using these harmful words on purpose. I'll talk a little bit later about how we can engage in dialogue about language and how we can approach the situation where someone says a word and we want to help them understand that this is a harmful word, but we also don't want to break our relationship with them. So I'll go into detail about that a little later. Megan asked a great question that whitelist is built into many systems, and AWS, for example, and how do we at Trello go around while using these tools? I actually don't know the answer how we're dealing with AWS in this particular example. I do know that we are in the process of cleaning out all references to master slave of our system in our systems. And I'm not sure how far we are along, but I know that's underway. I could get back to you on Slack on that. That's a really good question, how to work with partners. Donald is asking, should we not say Black Friday? Colors have other meanings more than skin color. This is a fantastic question and a really tricky one to answer. My personal answer to that is, and this may be the wrong answer, is that when I think of Black Friday, I don't know the history where Black Friday comes from. So I would probably, before using this in a presentation or in my work, I would probably try to look that up. It might be that this is just because of the color black, and Black Friday, at least the way I understand it, doesn't have particularly good or bad notions with the actual event of, I think it's a day, this is again where I'm German and I'm not American. This is a day where a lot of things are on sale. So maybe Black Friday is totally acceptable and it's really just a color as a descriptor. It might be that this refers to, has some sort of racist connotations in the past, and that's where this originates. So this would be a good thing to look up, and I unfortunately don't have the answer to that. Let's do the last question quick before we move on in the interest of time. Where do gendered words come from? That's a fantastic question. This goes into linguistics. I actually don't know why some languages have gender and why some languages don't. Some of those are just evolutionary, that this just started basically started evolving. But I'm not sure why German does have this and American English, for example, or English doesn't have this. All right, in the interest of time, we'll leave these questions up here, and I'll go into a little more detail on the next Q&A. So Margie and Donald will come into that, go into that in a few minutes, okay? Awesome, thanks for the questions. I love how y'all are engaging. This is super helpful. So we talked a little bit about how language impacts our reality. Let's talk about these areas of language that I spoke of that we should look out for. And the reason I'm saying areas is the language constantly evolves. So dictionaries and lists can quickly become outdated. It's important to refer to those, and it's important to understand what currently is considered acceptable, but it's also important to develop the spidey sense for when to be careful. And we'll go through a couple of examples here. The first area are characteristics. So any kind of language that may reflect prejudice, stereotype, or discriminatory views of particular people or groups. I'll give you an example. Characteristics are things like culture and religion, race and ethnicity, but also ableist language, sexual orientation, gender identity, ageist language, or socioeconomic status. This list is not exhaustive. There are probably more. I'm fairly confident that there are more. And I won't go through all of them, but I'll go through a couple of examples of these characteristics. A lot of you have probably heard of the term powwow before. This is something that's been used in the business world to describe a meeting. We'll do a powwow. Originally, this comes from the Native American word, I think it's pronounced powwow, and it means spiritual leader. It describes a social gathering or ceremony that's held in different Native American communities that can be spiritual symbolic. And when we use this lightly, we culturally appropriate this term that's actually very meaningful for groups of Native Americans. And the silly thing to me, or maybe I shouldn't say silly, but the obvious and empowering thing to me about this is that we can really replace this so easily, because all we're describing is a meeting, all we're describing is a session or a workshop. So I'd encourage you, when you hear these words that are used for effect, that actually have cultural connotations or cultural history, try to replace them with more with terms that are more generally applicable and don't tap into that trauma. There's some great, Jen, I love these suggestions. Native or indigenous is a great term to use. Let's go through one more example. Race and ethnicity. Grandfathered in, who's familiar with this term? I'm sure a lot of you are, and I embarrassingly have to admit that I've used this word this year. I only learned about the history of this term this year. Grandfathered in, if you're not familiar with it, usually means you get the benefits of an earlier generation, like on your cell phone plan. Like that's what we use it for in pricing situations a lot of times. Like I have a cell phone plan and I renew it and I get the same price from that earlier generation cell phone plan. However, the term actually originates with the practice of allowing voters in the southern states of the USA easier voting if they had a grandfather who voted before 1867. And Black voters whose grandparents were slaves did not have these relatives. So actually what this term refers to is an ugly and really unfair history of voter disenfranchisement that still continues to this day in a different form. But it's still in place right now. Peanut Gallery in the chat that Stephanie mentioned is another great example that is rooted in segregation and the separation of socioeconomic class in the theaters. Instead of grandfathered in, for example, we can use the term like legacy. Legacy brings with it the same idea that there's something in the past that impacts the present or the future, but it doesn't have these connotations in the historical or cultural relevancy. I'll go through one more example, and this is ableist language. Ableist language is one that often gets overlooked. A term that I've heard in design and that I've, again, shame on myself, I've used myself before, is OCD, that I'm very OCD about this. And OCD, if you're not familiar with this, it is an abbreviation of obsessive compulsive disorder, which is a mental disorder in which persons have thoughts or obsessions repeatedly, or they feel the need to perform certain routines repeatedly, compulsions. And this is a serious disorder for a lot of people. So when we use this lightly or for effect, we can make light of what's actually a serious disorder. And instead, simple words that we can use is just say tidy, right? I can say, oh, I like things neat. I like things tidy. I like things structured. And that way we convey the same notion, but we don't actually use something that's a real struggle for someone for effect. So that was the first area. Another area that I think is important to look out for, and this is specifically for the workplace, is military and family language. This type of language can easily mislead or cover up underlying values and incentive systems that aren't really appropriate for the workplace. So for example, military language in software or design, we often use terms like war games, trenches, front lines, battle plan, we go into a war room. And what this does is that it introduces principles and values and rules that in the military and in war situations, we've decided are acceptable. But in a workplace, it can lead to people requesting a military-like or warlike sacrifice, which is unreasonable, and it also easily leads to potentially exploitative relationships where we say, oh, we're at war with our competition, let's work longer hours, let's work 60, 70, 80 hours. This is something that I've seen personally, and it's something that I highly disencourage, or at least be very mindful of when you're using military and war terms. Another one, and this is funny to see on both sides, on the same slide together, is family language. Everyone here has probably heard someone say, oh, here at Acme, we're a family, to describe the company or the organization. And similar to military terms, this introduces the principles and rules of family to the workplace, which can be misleading because for your family, you're constantly doing things that are irrational. We're sacrificing for our family in ways that we wouldn't for the workplace. So when we bring this kind of notion to the workplace, it can make it easier again for unreasonable expectations to creep in and for exploitation to start. So again, these aren't as drastic as the first examples, but they're interesting areas of language that we should look out for and use very deliberately. The last and smallest one I'll talk about real quick is jargon and acronyms. So jargon and acronyms can exclude people and limit their impact. When I use a term or an acronym like KPIs and someone else in the room doesn't know basically what this means, number one, I'm excluding them actively from participating, so they can't actually contribute, and I'm losing as well. So we're both losing. They can't contribute, I can't benefit from their brain. So be careful about jargons and acronyms because it can easily exclude people, and it tends to exclude people from from specific backgrounds. So these are the three areas that I recommend looking out for. This doesn't mean that we can't use characteristics or military or family language or jargon and acronyms in the workplace or at home, right? It just means that those are areas where it's good to take a pause and say, is this the right thing to use? Should I use this? Is it necessary to use this type of language? All right, I'll stop here real quick for a Q&A. I see there's some questions come up. I'll go through these one by one. Margie asked, have you considered creating language principles to facilitate more inclusive design? At Atlassian, we actually just recently released a guide to more inclusive writing, but we don't have language principles, I believe. I'll show the guide in a little bit. I'm not sure if we have these principles actually written out. Vivian says, Black Friday refers to a financial term. In an adding machine, if you are in the negative, the ink is red. When you're in the black, it means you're positive. Retailers are usually not making a profit until that day, but with the increase in sales, they make a profit for the year. So based on that, and I haven't fact checked, but I believe Vivian is right. This makes a lot of sense. It seems to me that using the term Black Friday isn't inappropriate. At the same time, I'm white, I'm male, I'm straight. It's easy to declare something acceptable when you're not part of the group that's potentially affected. So I would probably, if I was in a situation where I made maybe a poster for Black Friday, I'd probably ask Black friends of mine to see how they felt. Katie asks a question, oh, people use dyslexia all the time. When I switch words around, I just had a dyslexic moment. For someone who has dyslexia, this can be hurtful. Yeah, I couldn't agree more. Exactly, if you have dyslexia or if you have OCD, when others use these terms lightly, it can feel hurtful. It can make light of what you're actually struggling with and what's made life potentially very hard for you in the past. I'll go in the chat. There's a couple of questions. I think Lewis asked, what about language's ability to create social bonds or safe spaces? Is there ever a case where exclusionary language is helpful to create a safe space for a marginalized group? I think that does exist, and I think that's a good use of language, is to create an in-group as well, as long as you're mindful about that and not accidentally using it. A lot of the examples that I'm talking about here, I assume that most people use them accidentally and without negative intention. So I think there's definitely a way for groups or spaces to coin their own language and through that create that safe space and bond. It's a fantastic call out, Lucas. Thank you. Anyone else have any questions right now? y'all are awesome about the chat. I kind of have to like scroll up a little bit. Yeah, I think I'll pronounce this Akna. I'm not sure if that's right, but that's exactly right. That family terms can be used to create dynamics of sacrifice and dedication that are not healthy and not actually like not healthy for a workplace. Great point. Awesome. Let's move on to the next section. We talked about how language shapes our reality, frames it, impacts it, and kind of what areas we want to look out for. Now, how do we actually turn this into some action? What are some things that we can do where we can't necessarily change all of language at once? The first part that I, as a designer, think of is just my design work. I usually start with the smallest unit and the thing that I can impact with that, like where I have the highest leverage of impacting it. So if you think that you as a designer don't use a lot of language, I'd encourage you to look through a day of yours again and think about all the moments where you actively use language and where there are opportunities to use more inclusive language or cut out some exclusive language. For example, in a day, I did this for myself. In a day, I wrote some copies, I created some labels, I worked on some personas, did some wireframes where I also used copy. I wrote a few emails and messages, did a report, and did a presentation like this one. And in all of these, we have an opportunity to, number one, not use language that might be harmful, but we also have an opportunity to lead and to start using language that is better and more inclusive so that other people can see that and start to adopt that as well. Personas are a particularly good example to me because anytime we're talking about our users, we can be more inclusive. I'll give you a couple examples. I believe it's generally a good idea to use gender neutral names for personas unless the gender really matters to the persona. Unless it's necessary to express the gender, I try to use gender neutral names and gender neutral pictures or images so that I'm not gendering them unnecessarily. I also try to use sex, religion, racial group, or disability or age only if necessary. So for Trello, for example, we have not seen that the gender of our users makes a difference in how they use Trello. We may just have not discovered it, we may not know about it, but so far we haven't seen the gender actually make a difference in how they use it. So it's not necessary for us to include that in personas because genders use Trello alike. On the other hand, disability is something that we do call out. So if someone has color blindness, for example, or is visually impaired in some way, we do call that out because we try to make Trello as accessible as possible. So in that sense, it is necessary to call this out and to use that characterization in the persona. And third, when we create personas, we basically create like a snapshot that represents a group of users. So we only use these characteristics if they reflect the diversity of the group appropriately. So that's specifically important for racial groups. Like if I create white male personas, does that actually reflect the diversity of the group that I'm speaking about? And am I doing them a favor? And am I being inclusive when I do that? So we talked about design work. This is stuff that I can do by myself. I can write the copy and the wireframes by myself. But one step up is tools and processes and resources, things I can bring to my team, to my company, to my organization that they can then use as well. And these are some of the things that people I think have asked about. And I'll give you a few really small examples. The first one that I'm a huge fan of because it's so tiny and so like compact is a Slack bot. Like whoever uses Slack, it's very easy to write a Slack bot for more inclusive language. This is an example from Luke Olive. If you look up Slackbot for inclusive language or Hey Guys, you'll probably find it on Google. And basically what he did is he wrote a Slackbot that whenever someone says Hey Guys in Slack, it sends them a message and says, hey, consider using a term that's gender neutral, like folks, team, everyone, instead of guys. And I love these small moments of nudging people into the right direction, right in context. It doesn't always have to be a big thing to help someone think about the language that they're using. In terms of processes, Atlassian has this team method that's called inclusive meetings. And while it's not language specific, I think it's a great example of introducing practices that are more inclusive. So taking language and moving one step out into the processes themselves, and bringing those to your team. There are instructions online. If you Google Atlassian Playbook or Atlassian Inclusive Meetings, you'll find instructions and materials for this. But a really great way to basically bring this into your work, and start to reach out to other people and include them in this process. And this is the inclusive writing that I mentioned earlier, that Atlassian recently released these guidelines. It's basically part of our design system now, and it's both a stance on inclusive language, but also our definition and some of the categories. A lot of what I've mentioned today are from our inclusive writing guidelines. We don't have specific principles yet, like they were asked about earlier, but there's a lot of good examples of what to not use and what to replace it with. And the last one is self-defined.app. This is a resource created by Tatiana Mack, and I'm a big fan of this. It's basically a dictionary where they gathered a lot of words that have connotations or effects that people might not know about. So it's a way to redefine what these terms mean. And there's a ton of depth in here, and you can actually contribute to it. So if you go to self-defined.app, you can request changes about the language, can add things to the language, to the documentation. It's a great resource. Highly recommend checking it out. So those are some of the resources that I recommend looking into and processes to bring into your work, into your impact zone. The last one, and the biggest one, although it feels like the smallest one, is engaging in dialogue about language. Now, this seems like such a non-brainer because we talk about language all the time, but truly engaging about dialogue and what's acceptable and what isn't is super important. And here's why. Language and culture aren't set in stone, right? They're constantly evolving, and they're not evolving naturally. We actually are evolving them as we use language, as we discuss language. And over time, this is the axis towards on the bottom, we decide what language is acceptable and what's unacceptable. And these differ from group to group, from society to society, from country to country. But generally, I believe, and this red line is my opinion, is that we're becoming slowly but surely better and establishing a higher quality bar for what we think is acceptable. So when we're negotiating what's acceptable and unacceptable, really what we're doing is we're discussing this zone in between those two, which is controversial. So controversial is this one person that says, oh, I think this term is correct. I think this term is acceptable. I think I can use it. We should all use it. And there's another person who thinks this term is unacceptable. And this is where we're negotiating those thresholds of acceptability in our language, whether we know it or not. Right? When we talk online and we call someone out on a term, these are those negotiations. So when you enter dialogue with someone about language, what you're doing is negotiating what's acceptable. And it's super important because this is really what makes language and what defines language. And here's just 3 tips that I found in literature and personally successful for this dialogue, because it can be really tricky, really difficult when someone you love says something that you find hurtful or harmful, and you confront them and have to call them out on it. It's very difficult sometimes. So the first tip that I would share with you is, before you engage in dialogue, it's actually to pause and reflect. A lot of times when we hear a word that's harmful, a word that's misleading, a term that has connotations that we find prejudiced or racist, we have a very visceral emotional response to that. And we should, right? It's all right to have that response. But when we try to invite them into the dialogue, that doesn't necessarily get us what we want to get to. So we're not at our best unless we pause and reflect and think about the stories that we're telling ourselves. In Crucial Conversations, the authors tell this master my stories. And it basically is, when we pause and reflect, we can think about, oh, what story am I telling myself about the intent that the other person used that word with and what they're trying to affect. And in contrast to that, what do I actually know to be true? So pausing and reflecting is really important before we even get into the dialogue with another person. The second one, equally important, is to create safety. We've talked a lot about psychological safety in the workplace, at home, in society, and this is no different. When we approach someone for using a word that's harmful, most likely they will feel like they're a victim or something like that. And they will generally retreat to one or the other. They'll retreat to violence or silence. And this is usually a sign that there's no safe space, right? Fight or flight, violence or silence. So when they're getting aggressive, when they're using violent words, it's a good sign that there's a lack of safety. If they're retreating or disengaging from the conversation, also a good sign that there's no safety. So before you get into the conversation, think about safety and think about what you're seeing from their behavior. And then when we do have this dialogue and this conversation, more often than not, in my experience, it goes really well. And we're so relieved that we're having this conversation, that we get to talk to them about it. And we find out that they didn't know, possibly, that they just find out about this today, this word, that this word has these meanings. And so we're so excited about it that we forget to end on an action. It's really important to close this dialogue and conversation with an action. So either with a decision, or a decision to make a decision at some point, or to establish a new ritual, or a better word for that. But ending on an action is really important, because otherwise you'll likely have this conversation again, and it'll be more difficult and difficult. So when it comes to practicing this and putting this into action, I would encourage you to think about your design work. What do you own? Where do you have a high level of influence? And what kind of language can you use there? Then what kind of tools and processes can you bring to your circle, to your team, to your friends, to your organizations? And thirdly, who can you engage in dialogue about language with? Like, who can you actually, like, it doesn't always have to be calling out, but who can you also ask about getting better at language? It goes in different directions. So this is all I had for today, and we're going to dive into some Q&A in a minute. But to wrap up, I want to leave you with a challenge. In a few days, all of you will probably be back in their day-to-day, back at work, back at home, back in the day-to-day life. And I challenge you to do 3 things with this information. One is, think about your day-to-day work or your design work and look for one opportunity to use more inclusive language. 2, think about one tool or process or resource that you can introduce to a circle or a group that you're working with, or that you're with in general. And then 3, and this is the trickiest one, and I really encourage and challenge you to do this, is think of one person that you can engage in dialogue about language with. This doesn't have to be the person that is most intimidating or most tricky or most aggravating to you. It can be any person, but just start to get into the habit of actively engaging in dialogue about language. And that's it for me for today. I say we switch to the Q&A now. So I'll go through the questions, and please keep the chat and questions going. Michaela asked, what are your thoughts on behavioral personas versus more traditional personas? I'm new to UX and learned to do the typical more interest demographic-based personas, but favor behavior-based ones. I feel like they include more relevant information like motivations, decision-making points, and frustrations without generalizing about certain backgrounds. I think I agree with Michaela here. I tend to think of personas or archetypes more in terms of their motivations, their attitudes, their behaviors. I think those are the meaningful personas or archetypes that help us make decisions in design. The ones that are very descriptive of roles are usually very specific, and they can be powerful, but I agree, they can easily lead to us generalizing certain backgrounds, certain characteristics about people that aren't actually helpful for us to make design decisions or product decisions. Erica, the name of the resource, it's called self-defined .app is the website. So self-defined.app. Then there's a question, what is the best way to ask someone to review something for inclusivity in a way they don't feel targeted? Oh, this is so tricky. This is such a fantastic question, and this is so difficult. I'll share how I have done this, but I will disclaim that, will issue the disclaimer that this might not be the best way. And the reason that is because there are dynamics between white and, for example, Black Americans that aren't necessarily always even. So like someone from a underrepresented group asking another group for help isn't the same as someone from a possibly dominant group in terms of like systemic racism asking the underrepresented group. So I would issue a big disclaimer, but the way I do this, and I've done this in the past, is basically just being honest and trying to be as vulnerable and open with them as possible, and starting with my intention. That my intention is to write inclusively, and I'm looking for help, and that they seem like a good resource to help me. And if they feel like they want to not engage in this, or that they feel like targeted, that they have an out to disengage. And that's why I usually send this in an email or a message first before I engage them directly, so that they have time to think about it. They have an option to not respond to this at all, which I usually don't follow up. If I ask once and I don't get a response, I usually don't follow up because I don't want to corner them much more. But I would say choose async communication for the first time, especially if you're not very familiar with that person. Does anybody else have any questions or any comments? I would encourage you to weigh in. Like, these answers are just my best answers, but I'm also on this journey towards getting better at this. So some folks in the audience may be well more equipped to answer these questions. Yeah, this is a great call out by Akira, that what works for one person or one group cannot work at all for another group. So one underrepresented group is not like the other, and the same rules don't necessarily apply. Yeah, Jen B, I couldn't agree more. Jen posted in the chat that actively building relationships, real relationships with people who are not exactly like you, is a great way to continually learn about all these biases and all these patterns that we internalize that we can't even see anymore, right? I literally probably don't know about some of the things that I do because they feel so natural. They feel like breathing to me. And so it takes meeting with other people and learning and engaging with other people to start to notice, oh, wow, I totally do this. I shouldn't do this anymore. Yeah, Stephanie brought up a great point that family language can bring up trauma and abuse too. A lot of times when we use family language in the workplace, it infers that there's unconditional love and that the family is loving and safe and it's all there's harmony, but that's not the case for everyone. So again, it's something where some folks may feel alienated or excluded. Awesome. If there's no other questions, I'm happy to cut this short a little bit. I'll jump over to the Austin Design Week Slack. And we can, if you're interested, we can engage more there and talk more about this. And Karma, I believe is how it's pronounced, called out nonviolent communication. Also a great framework for asking for the change you want and need without imputing motives or ill will to others. Really great. I love this. I love all the resources you're all mentioning. This is awesome. Great. Thank you all for being here. Danielle, did you have anything to close? Is there anything else to call out?
No, thank you so much, Yanis. This was great. Our volunteers dropped in the chat a survey we would love to have you fill out. And then also just a reminder to join the community in Slack. And as Yanis said, he'll hop over there and y'all can keep this conversation going. And then check out all the events that we have this week. So thank you all so much. And a big thank you to Yanis.
Thanks, y'all.